The voicemail didn't mention my sister. It just said, in my mother's clipped, nicotine-laced tone, that space was tight at the anniversary venue. 30 years of marriage, 50 guests, zero room for their eldest daughter. I almost believed the lie. Then, my phone buzzed with a photo upload. I spent the evening of my parents' 30th wedding anniversary scrubbing the grout in my bathroom. It's a specific kind of pathetic. Leaning over a discolored tub with a splayed toothbrush, breathing in bleach fumes until the back of your throat burns. I kept my phone on the closed toilet seat, silent, screen face down. The hum of the cheap fluorescent tube above the mirror was the only sound in the apartment, save for the occasional wet screech of the bristles against the tiles. My knuckles were red, the skin stretched tight and dry. I wasn't crying, I was just focused. Scrubbing away the mildew felt like something I could actually control. My mother, Helen, had called me 3 days earlier to uninvite me. I was standing in the kitchen when she did it, picking at a flake of dried paint on the radiator. I can still hear the ice clinking against the glass of her gin and tonic over the receiver. She always drinks out of these heavy crystal tumblers that sound like wind chimes when she stirs them with a silver spoon. Nora, she had said, exhaling a long plume of smoke. I didn't need to see her to know she was picking a stray fleck of tobacco off her lower lip. We've finalized the head count for the dinner. Okay, I said, my voice cautious. The thing is, the private dining room at the Savoy is significantly smaller than the coordinator led us to believe. Another clink of ice, a sharp inhale. And considering your energy lately, your father and I thought it might be best if you sat this one out. My energy. It was her polite, country club euphemism for the fact that my life was currently a burning dumpster. 10 months ago, the boutique bakery I'd poured my life savings into went under. 6 months ago, my boyfriend of 4 years packed his bags while I was at a temp job and left a note on the kitchen island that just said, "I can't do this anymore." I was 32, drowning in debt, and living in a one-bedroom apartment that constantly smelled of old onions and damp drywall. "It's an anniversary, Nora," my mother had added, her voice dropping into that soothing, patronizing register she reserved for stray dogs and me. "Not a therapy session. We just want a light, happy evening. You understand, right, sweetie?" The way she said sweetie felt like a thumb pressing hard into a fresh bruise. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't defended myself. I had just stood there, the coil of the phone cord wrapped tightly around my index finger, cutting off the circulation until the tip turned purple. "Sure, Mom, I understand. We'll do a separate dinner, just the 3 of us. Sometime next month when things settle down," she promised. A lie so practiced it rolled off her tongue like water. She hung up before I could say goodbye. Now, kneeling on the bath mat, I tossed the ruined toothbrush into the sink. The fumes were making my eyes water. Or maybe that was just an excuse I was giving myself for the hot, stinging sensation behind my eyelids. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room, and turned on the faucet to wash the caustic smell of the bleach off my hands. It didn't work. It never does. The chemical scent clings to your pores, sinking into the skin. I walked out into the living room. The streetlights outside cast long, distorted shadows across the scuffed hardwood floor. It was raining a thin, miserable drizzle that streaked the single-pane windows with grime. My sister, Paige, hadn't called. That was the detail that chewed at the inside of my cheek all week. Paige was 28, a luxury real estate agent who married a corporate lawyer named Thomas. She smelled like expensive peonies and crisp, newly printed money. Her life was frictionless. When she dropped out of college, my parents called it a brave journey of self-discovery and bankrolled a gap year in Italy. When I lost my bakery, they called it a predictable consequence of poor planning and suggested I look into administrative work. I knew Paige would be at the dinner. She was the golden child, the one who never brought heavy energy to a room, mainly because her problems could all be solved by writing a check. I imagined her there right now, sitting in a velvet chair at the Savoy, holding a flute of champagne, laughing at one of my father's dry jokes. My stomach gave a hollow, metallic growl. I hadn't eaten since noon. I grabbed my phone from the bathroom and ordered takeout from the Thai place down the street. It was too expensive for my budget, but I figured I was saving money by not buying an anniversary gift. I needed something heavy and greasy to anchor me to the couch. 30 minutes later, the delivery guy buzzed. I tipped him with the last crumpled $5 bill in my wallet, carried the plastic bag to the coffee table, and sat cross-legged on the faded rug. The styrofoam container squeaked horribly as I pried it open. The smell of fish sauce, lime, and crushed peanuts hit the air, instantly overpowering the lingering scent of bathroom cleaner. I snapped apart the cheap wooden chopsticks, feeling a tiny splinter snag the skin of my thumb. I picked it out with my teeth, tasting salt and copper, and dug into the noodles. I turned on the TV. It was an infomercial for a ceramic frying pan, the volume muted. The screen flashed bright blue and harsh white, illuminating the dark apartment in erratic bursts. I took a bite of the noodles. They were lukewarm and gummy. I chewed mechanically, staring at the muted television host cracking an egg into the pan. I was surviving. I was fine. I didn't need a seat at a table where I wasn't wanted. I was an adult. Then, my phone vibrated against the glass of the coffee table, a sharp, aggressive bzz, bzz that cut through the silence. I froze, a clump of noodles halfway to my mouth. I told myself not to look. I knew what it would be. A pity text from my father. Thinking of you, kiddo. Or worse, a text from Paige, drunk on Pinot Noir, asking why I hadn't at least sent a card. I put the chopsticks down. I wiped my greasy fingers on my jeans. I picked up the phone. It wasn't a text. It was an Instagram notification. Paige Bennett posted a new photo. I stared at the lock screen for a long time. The blue light reflected in my eyes, cold and harsh. Don't open it, I thought. Just swipe left. Clear it. Put the phone face down and go back to the cold noodles. You know it's going to hurt. You know it's just a picture of them at the restaurant, looking perfect and airbrushed, pretending you don't exist. But curiosity is a parasitic thing. It burrows into the brain and feeds on your worst impulses. My thumb moved before my rational mind could stop it. I tapped the notification. The app loaded, the little circles spinning for a fraction of a second before the image snapped into sharp, high-definition focus. The first thing I noticed was the lighting. It wasn't the dim, romantic, candlelit ambiance of the Savoy's private dining room. It was bright, golden hour sunlight filtering through tall, ancient pine trees, casting dappled shadows across a massive wooden deck. My breath caught in my throat. A physical obstruction, like I had swallowed a stone. I knew that deck. I helped my father stain that wood when I was 16. I knew the specific groove on the handrail where our old golden retriever used to chew the cedar. I knew the way the pine needles accumulated in the corners. It was the lake house. I zoomed in, my thumb trembling so badly I accidentally double-tapped the screen, leaving a little red heart on the photo. I let out a choked, panicked sound, a laugh that fractured into a cough, and quickly unliked it, my chest heaving. I looked at the people in the photo. My mother stood in the center, wearing a cream-colored cashmere wrap, her hair perfectly blown out, holding a glass of white wine. My father had his arm around her waist, smiling a genuine, relaxed smile I hadn't seen him wear in a decade. On my mother's other side stood Paige. She looked radiant in a simple sundress, leaning her head on our mother's shoulder. Thomas, Paige's husband, stood behind them, looking like a catalog model for yachtwear. They looked incredibly happy. They looked like a complete family. But it was the setting that made the nausea rise in my throat, thick and sour. 2 years ago, when my bakery was on the verge of eviction, I went to my parents. I didn't ask for a handout. I asked for a loan. I drafted a business plan. I offered them equity. I sat at their polished mahogany dining table and cried, begging them to help me save the only thing I had ever built. My mother had looked at me with deep, practiced sympathy. "Oh, Nora," she had said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "We simply don't have the liquidity right now. In fact, your father and I are making some very difficult choices ourselves. We've decided to sell the lake house. The property taxes are just too much, and a developer made us a cash offer we couldn't refuse. We have to secure our retirement." I had mourned that house. I spent my childhood summers swimming in that lake, scraping my knees on that dock, reading paperbacks on that deck. When they told me it was going to be torn down for condos, I spent 3 days in bed, crying for the loss of my childhood sanctuary. I told myself it wasn't their fault they couldn't help me. They were losing something too. I looked beneath the photo to read Paige's caption. "Cheers to 30 years of the best parents in the world. So incredibly blessed. And the biggest, most massive thank you to Mom and Dad for the ultimate anniversary surprise, officially passing the deed to the lake house down to Thomas and me. Can't wait to raise our future kids here. The legacy continues. Number family first, number lake life, number surprise. I dropped the styrofoam container. It tipped off the coffee table, hitting the rug with a dull thud. The pad thai spilled out, a mess of orange grease and noodles soaking instantly into the cheap beige fibers of the carpet. I didn't care. I didn't even look at it. I just stared at the phone. They didn't sell it. There was no developer. There was no cash offer. They lied to my face, watched me lose my business, watched me spiral into debt and depression, because they wanted to hold on to the property to give it to Paige as a free gift. And they scheduled this anniversary party at the lake house, entirely behind my back, knowing I couldn't be there to see it. Space was tight. The sheer, staggering weight of the betrayal didn't hit me with a clean, cinematic rage. It hit me like a physical illness. My vision swam, the edges of the room blurred. The smell of the spilled fish sauce on the rug suddenly made me gag. I clapped a hand over my mouth, squeezing my eyes shut, rocking forward on the floor. The legacy continues. I opened my eyes. The screen was still lit up, the smiling faces of my family mocking me in high definition. I didn't think about what I was doing. The rational part of my brain had completely short-circuited. I exited Instagram, opened my contacts, and pressed Paige's name. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. I hoped she wouldn't answer. I wanted to hang up. My hands were shaking, slippery with sweat. Nora! Paige's voice chirped through the speaker. She sounded out of breath, slightly buzzed. In the background, I could hear the unmistakable sound of a live acoustic guitar and the dull roar of a dozen people talking and laughing over each other. 50 guests, 0 room. You're at the lake, I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was thin, reedy, scraping out of my throat like dry leaves on pavement. The background noise suddenly muffled, as if she had clamped a hand over the microphone or walked into a different room. A door clicked shut. The guitar faded. Nora! Hey! Paige said, her tone dropping the chirpy facade instantly. It shifted into the careful, managed voice of someone dealing with a volatile customer. Are you looking at Instagram? I meant to block you from that post. I clicked the wrong setting. You meant to block me, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. You didn't sell it. 2 years ago, Mom said she sold it to a developer. Paige let out a long, heavy sigh, the kind of sigh that said I was being entirely unreasonable. Look, Nora, Mom just... She panicked. Okay? You were in a really bad place, asking for a ton of money for a bakery that was already failing. You know how she gets about finances. She didn't want to be the bad guy and tell you no to your face, so she made up the developer thing. She watched me lose everything, Paige. She watched me pack my equipment into cardboard boxes. I went into bankruptcy. And that's awful. We all felt terrible for you, Paige said, defensively. But it wasn't Mom's responsibility to bail you out of a bad business decision. She wanted to keep the house in the family, by giving it to you. Thomas and I are starting a family soon, she said, her voice hardening, losing the last trace of guilt. We have the income to maintain the property taxes and do the upkeep. It just made sense. It's a practical decision, Nora. Please don't do this right now. Don't ruin their anniversary with your drama. Your drama. I looked down at the ruined noodles on my rug. I looked at my red, raw knuckles from scrubbing the grout of a bathroom I didn't own, in an apartment I could barely afford. I wanted to say something cutting. I wanted to deliver a line so sharp and devastating that it would pierce through her expensive perfume and her perfect life. I wanted to make her feel the crushing, suffocating weight of what they had done, but I couldn't find the words. The exhaustion was too heavy. It sat in my bones like lead. You told me space was tight at the Savoy, I whispered, the humiliation burning my cheeks. It was just easier this way, Paige said quietly. You would have made it weird. You always make it weird, Nora. You carry around all this resentment, and it just brings the mood down. I ended the call. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't yell. I just pressed the red button, placed the phone gently on the glass coffee table, and lay down on the floor right next to the spilled takeout. The cheap fibers of the rug scratched against my cheek. I lay there in the dark, watching the ceramic frying pan on the muted television, listening to the rain hit the glass, completely and utterly alone. I woke up with a brutal carpet burn on my left cheek. The apartment smelled like a humid mixture of rancid peanut oil, stale garlic, and old dust. The styrofoam container was a crushed, greasy white shell, resting inches from my face. The pad thai had hardened overnight into a stiff, coagulated lump on the beige rug. I lay there for a long time, watching a single, lethargic housefly crawl over a petrified lime wedge. My neck throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I sat up slowly, my joints popping like dry twigs breaking in a quiet forest. The television had gone into sleep mode at some point, casting a dead, black reflection of my living room. The rain had stopped, but the sky outside my single window was the color of dirty dishwater. It was Sunday morning. I didn't feel angry. That was the strangest, most unsettling part of it all. I fully expected to wake up with a chest full of fire, ready to draft a blistering text message, ready to burn down their manicured, curated lives with righteous fury. Instead, I felt entirely hollowed out. A scraped clean melon. I pushed myself off the floor, my knees aching against the cold hardwood. I went into the kitchen, pulled a black garbage bag from under the sink, and walked back to the living room. I scooped the ruined takeout into the plastic with my bare hands. The noodles felt cold and gelatinous. I sprayed the carpet with a harsh, citrus-scented chemical cleaner, scrubbing the orange grease stain with a wad of paper towels until the cheap paper shredded into wet, white pills. The stain didn't come out. It just faded into a muddy, permanent bruise in the fibers. I stopped scrubbing. I sat back on my heels and stared at it. I was going to lose my security deposit over that stain. A month ago, that realization would have sent me into a spiral of financial panic. Today, I just tossed the wet paper towels into the trash bag and tied it shut. I walked into my bedroom and pulled the rickety step stool from the closet. On the top shelf, pushed all the way to the back behind my winter coats, sat a heavy plastic storage bin. I dragged it down, dust motes dancing heavily in the gray morning light. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, vibrating through the thin floorboards. Inside was my inheritance. The emotional kind, anyway. I knelt beside the bin and popped the plastic latches. The smell of old paper and cedar hit my nose. These were the things I had kept to prove to myself that I was part of a family. A heavy, tarnished, silver hairbrush my mother gave me for my 16th birthday. A stack of generic birthday cards featuring my father's cramped, obligatory cursive. "Proud of you, kiddo. Love, Dad." The handmade, lopsided ceramic mug I painted for them in 3rd grade, which I had found in their Goodwill donation pile 5 years ago and quietly rescued. I picked up the mug. The rim was chipped, exposing the rough, porous clay beneath the shiny blue glaze. I realized then what Paige had meant by my heavy energy. They didn't hate me because I had failed. They hated me because my failure was a mirror they simply refused to look into. In their pristine world, success was a moral virtue, and struggle was a character flaw, a contagious disease they needed to quarantine. I was the stain on their immaculate rug. They couldn't scrub me out, so they just put a piece of heavy furniture over me and pretended I wasn't there. I went to the corner of the room, flattened an empty cardboard moving box from my bakery, and taped the bottom. I didn't wrap the ceramic mug in newspaper. I didn't polish the silver brush. I didn't reread the cards. I just dropped them into the box. Clatter, clatter, thud. I found a few more items. A dried corsage from high school. A framed photo of the 4 of us at the lake house they now owned. The lake house they had used as a tombstone for my business. I looked at the glass over the photo. My mother's smile was tight, her eyes not quite reaching the corners. Paige was leaning into our father. I was standing slightly apart, holding the old golden retriever by the collar. Even back then, I was just the hired help managing the background noise. I dropped the frame into the box. The glass cracked against the heavy silver hairbrush. I didn't care. I walked into the bathroom and flipped the switch. The fluorescent bulb flickered, buzzing like an angry wasp before settling into a harsh, clinical glare. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were heavily bloodshot, my hair matted on one side from sleeping on the floor. I looked like a woman who had just lost everything. But as I leaned closer, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink, I noticed the skin around my jaw. It was tight, set. The tremor that had been in my hands for the last 10 months, the low-level, vibrating anxiety of trying to please people who were determined to be disappointed by me, was completely gone. I washed my face with freezing cold water. The shock of it made me gasp, driving the stale air out of my lungs. I dried off with a towel that smelled faintly of mildew, pulled on a pair of faded denim jeans, a clean gray sweater, and my heavy leather boots. I walked to the front door and grabbed my keychain from the ceramic bowl. I detached the shiny brass spare key to their house. I picked up the cardboard box. It wasn't physically heavy, but carrying it felt like hauling a corpse out of my apartment. The drive to the suburbs took exactly 45 minutes. The Sunday morning traffic was practically non-existent. The sky remained the color of wet concrete, pressing down on the city with a humid, suffocating pressure. The radio was turned off. The only sound was the rhythmic squeak of my windshield wipers dragging across dry glass every time my hand brushed the lever by mistake. I turned onto Elmwood Drive. It was a tunnel of ancient, arching oak trees and aggressively manicured lawns that looked like pudding greens. My car, a dented 10-year-old sedan with a rattling muffler and a cracked taillight, disrupted the silent, wealthy neighborhood like a gunshot. I pulled into my parents' driveway, parking directly over the oil-free asphalt where my father usually parked his Mercedes. They wouldn't be back from the lake house until late tonight. They had a brunch scheduled with Thomas's parents this morning. I knew the itinerary. Paige had posted it on her story 3 hours ago. I turned off the engine. The silence of the cabin rushed in, thick and heavy. I grabbed the box from the passenger seat, stepped out into the humid air, and walked up the slate path. The air smelled of wet mulch and expensive, nitrogen-rich fertilizer. I slid the brass key into the heavy oak front door. The deadbolt clicked open, with a smooth, well-oiled snap. I stepped inside. The house was completely silent, climate-controlled to a perfect, artificial 68 degrees. It smelled of lemon polish and the vanilla reed diffusers my mother strategically placed in every room to mask the smell of her cigarettes. I walked through the foyer, my boots squeaking faintly on the polished marble tile. I paused by the hallway console table. Above it hung a massive, professionally framed family portrait taken last Christmas. I stopped to look at it, really look at it, for the first time. There was Paige, glowing and centered, draped in silk. There were my parents, beaming with the relaxed confidence of people who had never missed a mortgage payment. And there I was, positioned on the far left edge, wearing a dark, shapeless sweater, my smile tight and entirely unconvincing. The photographer had used a shallow depth of field, blurring the edges of the frame for artistic effect. It meant that I was literally, physically out of focus in my own family's portrait. I carried the cardboard box into the kitchen. The granite countertops were spotless, gleaming under the recessed lighting. I set the box down heavily on the center island. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a black Sharpie, and looked around for a piece of paper. I found a thick, cream-colored notepad next to the landline phone. I didn't want to write a letter. Letters were for people who desperately wanted to be understood, and I had spent 32 years bleeding myself dry, trying to make them understand me. You can't explain the concept of water to someone who fundamentally refuses to acknowledge thirst. I clicked the cap off the marker. The sharp, chemical smell of the ink cut through the cloying vanilla air. I wrote 4 words in block letters. Space granted. Keep this. I tore the sheet off the pad and taped it to the top flap of the cardboard box. I took the brass spare key and set it squarely in the center of the paper. It sat there, a tiny, heavy anchor. I looked around the kitchen one last time. The gleaming, double-door stainless steel refrigerator. The decorative bowl of fake, dust-free lemons sitting on the massive dining table where they had looked me in the eye and lied about the lake house. It was a beautiful, magazine-ready house, but it was just a house. It wasn't a home. Now that I was standing here in the silence, I realized it never had been. I turned on my heel and walked out. I didn't look back. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. Click. The deadbolt engaged automatically, locking me out for good. I walked back down the slate path to my rattling, embarrassing car. When I got in and shut the door, I gripped the steering wheel. The cheap, imitation leather was cold and peeling under my palms. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed violently, and finally caught with a ragged, uneven roar. As I backed out of the driveway and drove away, I rolled the window down all the way. The humid, gray suburban air rushed into the car, smelling of impending rain and wet pavement. It whipped my hair across my face. It wasn't a triumphant, cinematic escape. My bank account was still completely empty. I still had to wake up at 6 in the morning on Monday to take the bus to a soul-crushing data entry temp job. The orange grease stain was still waiting for me on my cheap apartment rug. My chest still physically hurt, my heart beating like a bruised, tender thing trapped behind my ribs. But as I turned onto the highway on-ramp, watching the manicured trees of their neighborhood disappear forever in my rearview mirror, my lungs expanded. The air pulling into my chest tasted sharp and terrifyingly clean. I was an orphan by choice, and for the first time in my entire life, there was finally enough space. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more raw, unfiltered stories. We've all felt the sting of toxic family dynamics, and sharing these experiences helps us heal together. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had to walk away from family to save your own sanity? I read every single one. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. See you in the next one.